Friends, last week we looked more closely at the opening act of the book, in which we encountered the image of Christ, the exalted King of creation, surrounded by 7 lampstands, symbols of the 7 churches to whom John was writing. And this was followed by 7 short messages to the 7 churches. And we saw how the image of Christ that John describes was really made up of a collage of at least 20 Old Testament passages, most especially from Daniel's description of a heavenly being whom he described as one like a son of man, or alternatively, the human one. Today I'd like to explore images from the next section of the book, and again, John draws abundantly from images and verses of the Old Testament. The first thing that happens is John sees a door or a window in heaven. The Greek word for heaven could be translated as sky. John sees this opening or a door or a portal in the sky. An angel invites him to come up. The words "come up here" echo the words of God from Mount Sinai calling Moses up the mountain. And what John then sees is a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one seated on the throne has the appearance of jasper and ruby, a rainbow that shone like an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and on them 24 elders dressed in white with crowns on their heads. And from the throne there are flashes of lightning, peals of thunder, and before the throne 7 blazing lamps representing the 7 spirits of God, or the sevenfold Spirit of God, as some translations have it, suggesting the fullness and completeness of God's Spirit. Before the throne we encounter 4 living creatures, the first like a lion, the second like an ox, the third with a face of like a human, and the fourth like a flying eagle, each having 6 wings, covered in eyes, and day and night they never stop saying, "Holy, holy, holy." These creatures are very similar to creatures that Ezekiel describes in Ezekiel chapter 1, and that hymn, "Holy, holy, holy," has echoes from Isaiah 6. And so this is a rich picture full of symbolism, which again draws from passages from the Old Testament, and primarily from Isaiah 6 and Ezekiel 1. It's perhaps a reminder, the fact that they draw from these Old Testament passages, but there are significant differences if you read all the passages. It's a reminder that what we are dealing with here or reading is not a literal picture of heaven. It's a symbolic picture that's meant to communicate meaning rather than give us a so-called literal videotaped glimpse of heaven. Although we use the language of God seated on a throne, as the writer John has done in Revelation 4, this language is not literally true. It is a human attempt at using human language and human imagery to speak of a truth and a reality that words cannot describe. In ancient times, as a human being, living in a political system where kings ruled by sitting on a throne, if you wanted to speak of a higher authority, a higher law, and a higher wisdom that all people and all creation live under and are somehow answerable to, how would you describe that in language that other people could process and relate to? You would use the language of a great cosmic king, seated in majesty on a great cosmic throne. But Jesus reminds us in John's Gospel that this kind of language is ultimately symbolic and metaphoric, and not to be taken too literally, for he reminds us that God is spirit. God is like an invisible moving life force or breath that gives life and breath to all, and yet who is also not just an impersonal force, but is also somehow a personal presence. But very quickly, one begins to run out of words. It's much easier to describe God, the supreme authority and wisdom of the universe, seated on a throne. This is language that ordinary human minds can grasp. The image is useful and helpful, But we do need to be careful of not taking it too literally, or we could be in danger of creating another idol in the image of a human being. I'd now like to look at the symbolism and imagery that John uses in Revelation 4. Firstly, isn't it interesting that the one seated on the throne is not described as a human, as Isaiah does in Isaiah 6, but rather described with the imagery of sparkling and shining precious stones of jasper, ruby, and emerald. In true Jewish tradition, John has resisted the temptation to make an image of the divine. As one Bible commentary puts it, since God dwells in unapproachable light, as we read in 1 Timothy, and since God is one whom no one has seen, as we hear in the passage in the Old Testament, John describes God rather in terms of the reflected brilliance of precious stones. It's a reminder that at the heart of life there is a supreme, divine, spiritual reality that reigns over us and within us, and which is our true source and the source of all that is beautiful and precious and pure in this life. Secondly, surrounding the throne, we read of 24 thrones with 24 elders dressed in white with golden crowns on their heads. The 24 thrones and elders are most probably a reference in John's mind to the 12 tribes or patriarchs of Israel and the 12 apostles of the Christian church, the communities of both the Old and the New Covenants. Some would say this indicates that Revelation was written before the split of Judaism and Christianity, when most Christians still saw themselves as being part of the wider Jewish tradition. But in a wider sense, the 24 thrones and the 12 elders might represent all people who live in harmony with the divine reality at the heart of life, the saints and holy people of every time, place, and age. It's a reminder that our humanity finds its true nobility and dignity, and its true meaning and purpose when lived in harmony with the divine. Thirdly, we read that from the throne there are flashes of lightning and peals of thunder. And the imagery reflects the imagery of God meeting Moses on Mount Sinai and conveys the idea that God is the source of all power behind the whole universe. Even for modern people, lightning and thunder are reminders that human beings are actually very small and that there are powers and forces far greater than us at work in the universe. Fourthly, this takes us on to the next image, that before the throne there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. This image has echoes from Ezekiel's opening vision of God on a throne, except in Ezekiel's description it is a vault above the throne that was something like a vault sparkling like crystal. The image of the crystal sea in Revelation 4 is suggestive of a deep peace and tranquility, still waters, as we read in Psalm 23. It's a symbol of the eternal peace and the eternal stillness of God that forms the backdrop to the whole of life. All of life emerges from the divine stillness, and all life returns again into it. The last symbol I'd like to look at is that of the rainbow that shone like emerald encircling the throne. The emerald color of green is suggestive of life and abundance, that God is the source of abundant life, of all life. The rainbow itself is an image that takes us back to that story of Noah and God's promise after the flood to hang up his warrior's bow and never again to bring destruction upon the earth. Which raises a question, why? If God has vowed never again to bring destruction to the earth, why do we see in the very next section 3 sets of 7 judgments being poured out upon the earth as each of the 7 seals are opened, the 7 trumpets are sounded, and the 7 bowls are poured out upon the earth. For me, it's another reminder that when I read the judgments in the Bible and in the book of Revelation, I think of consequences. In the book of Romans, for example, Paul says that the judgment and wrath of God is ultimately this, that God gives us over to our own waywardness until we experience the consequences. In the context of Revelation, when an empire like the Roman Empire consistently builds itself on injustice, oppression and violence, it is built on a very fragile foundation. For a time, it may grow strong, but there's only so long that you can defy the moral arc of the universe before it catches up and the system begins to crumble, as the Roman Empire finally began to do from 376 AD, undermined by its own decadence, leading to internal weaknesses, undermined also by war, disease and famine, that led to its final downfall in the West in 476 AD. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that are unleashed with the opening of the first seal of the scroll in chapter 5 are widely interpreted to represent conquest, war, famine, and pestilence or disease. As Tim Mackey says, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse represent a tragically ordinary day in the history of humanity. And as Marshall Davis says, these 4 horsemen, these 4 forces of conquest, war, famine, and pestilence or disease have always worked together in history to bring down the many empires that have ruled the world. A reminder also that in this world, as the writer of Hebrews suggests, there is no enduring or lasting city. One could also say there is no lasting empire. Which is why, as people of faith, our ultimate fulfillment can never be found in building little kingdoms for ourselves in this world. Our true fulfillment will come as we live for a greater, more enduring purpose, as we live for a truth or a reality that transcends this world. In the language of our Christian tradition, it is the kingdom of the risen Christ. Getting back to the image of the throne. When I was at university, I became part of a very evangelical organization called Campus Crusade for Christ. I never quite felt comfortable in the organization, perhaps because I'd never really grown up in that kind of very evangelical atmosphere. But I had a very good friend who was part of it, who drew me in. And in the evangelical outreach of Campus Crusade, one of the key questions that they would ask as they sought to bring people to conversion and commitment to Christ was whether that person, whether it was either they or Christ who was seated on the throne of their lives. Now, while I would still struggle with the narrow evangelical framework that Campus Crusade operates within, there is something about that question that still rings true. And I guess the image of the throne in Revelation 4 ultimately asks us a very similar question. Who or what is seated on the throne of our hearts or the throne of our lives? Who or what claims our highest allegiance and the greatest commitment of us in this life? Who or what is the driving force behind the decisions and plans that we make in life? Is it the presence of the one who shines with beauty and radiance like jasper and ruby and an emerald rainbow? Or is it something else or someone else? Who is it who is seated on the throne of our hearts, the throne of our lives? Amen.